The damp chill of the night air had just begun to burn off as the sky lightened and the sun climbed over the edges of the lake. They could feel the temperature rising with the sun, the smell of fish and water sharper, the sound of lapping waves against the hull of the boat rhythmic and lulling after a long night of fishing. And as the sun came up, the dew on the beach began to glisten and the whole scene sparkled. To look out more than just a few feet in front of you, you would have had to shield your eyes. And the breeze coming off the water was fresh, cooled by the water below it. Birds woke up and began to soar overhead, crying out as they begun their daily hunt for food. Anyone on the lake that morning would have felt the possibilities of newness as dawn broke. In this new day, on that glossy morning on the beach, suddenly it began to seem possible that one might forget the struggles of grief and loss and death, the uncertainty of the future. And that is exactly where you and I find Jesus' disciples this morning. Just after crucifixion, after they'd seen Jesus in the upper room, after they'd been confronted, threatened, you might say, with the possibility of resurrection. But then, after all that, the pain and fear and grief and exhaustion and hope and possibility, they didn't know what to do. They've heard of resurrection. They'd actually seen Jesus twice. One day, life had unfolded with a familiar rhythm, and the next day, everything changed. But even the disciples knew that they couldn't stay in a locked room forever, waiting for they didn't know what, trying to imagine how they might live into a reality that did not exist in any experience they knew of. Life goes on, as we know, and the implications of resurrection, well, a nice idea to imagine after all the horror they'd lived through. Well, that was too scary to get your mind around. It couldn't be. And not just because what you and I know about human life, but because fundamentally, if resurrection was true, if the power of resurrection, of new life, of possibility, of hope, a future began to be unfurled in their lives and in the world, well, can you just imagine what might happen? And so the disciples finally unlocked the door and came down the stairs back to their regular lives. What that was, of course, was what they'd been doing their whole lives, fishing on the lake. They came out of the upper room, but their hearts were still locked. They were unable to welcome resurrection, not because they couldn't believe, but because resurrection was such a threat to everything they knew to be true. And out on the lake that morning, busily living as they always had, they heard a voice calling from the shore, "Hey there!" A man, they couldn't quite make out who he was with all that glittering sun on the water. And he asked them, like you do, about their catch from the night before. They held up empty nets to show him nothing, not one fish. "Throw them on the other side," the man on the shore called. Who knows what made the disciples try that after such a long and frustrating night, but they did. And as the nets began to fill with fish, so many fish they couldn't pick the nets up, a realization settled over them, stunning them into awareness. There, over there on the beach, it's Jesus. Jesus showed up on the lake that morning and stopped them in their tracks. He threatened them with resurrection, and they changed. And Saul, well-meaning, self-righteous, letter of the law, Saul, religious leader with the ultimate pedigree, was also threatened by resurrection. Saul was an up-and-coming leader of the temple, full of promise, political potential. He was both a Jew and a Roman, a zealot who loved rules and policies and order. And while he'd been bothered by the little group of rabble-rousing followers of that rogue Rabbi Jesus, all of these rumors of resurrection had him up in arms. To keep order, to preserve the status quo, to maintain life in the safe and well-ordered way he knew, Saul was now determined to use every personal and political power he had to root them out, to get rid of them altogether. In fact, post-resurrection, Saul had already been busy orchestrating terrible but justified in his mind things like the stoning of Stephen. Saul lived his life, the text says, breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. His latest effort included the acquisition of letters of introduction to the temple in Damascus, where in our passage today he was headed to try to instigate another public capture and perhaps execution of followers of the way, to send the message to Jesus' followers that Jesus' radical message of love and reconciliation and inclusion and justice would not be tolerated by him. And as Saul hurried down the dusty road to Damascus that afternoon, hot sun overhead, you know he was stalwart in his conviction. He knew the purpose and the focus of his life, and it was to return things to the order that he knew, to stamp out rumors of resurrection, to stop the followers of the way before they gained any more ground. It wasn't that Saul didn't believe in resurrection. That wasn't even on his mind. It was that if even the mere suggestion of resurrection, of recreation, of new life, of possibility, of hope, of future began to be unfurled in his life and in the world, well, everything about who he was and how he lived in the world would have to change. To gain the possibility of resurrection, Saul would lose so much: control, certainty, position, facade. And well, that was downright threatening. And there on the dusty road in the hot sun of that afternoon, Saul hurried along, going over and over again, the strategy in his head, no doubt, and suddenly it was like something hit him, just knocked him off his feet. A bright light, brighter than any he had ever seen, blinded him. And as he knelt in the dust of the road, covering his eyes from the light, he heard a voice speaking to him. "Saul, why do you persecute me?" It was Jesus. Jesus showed up on that dusty road to Damascus that afternoon and stopped Saul in his tracks. Jesus threatened Saul with resurrection, and Saul changed. For the first disciples and for Saul and maybe for us, resurrection is so much worse than a vague hope. It's an outright threat. If resurrection was true, if you and I really embrace the possibility that God is at work in our lives and in this world, fixing, healing, bringing things, relationships, people we thought long dead to life. If we even had the courage to consider the possibility of resurrection, everything would change. Resurrection would totally transform the way we interact with each other. It would reorder the priorities we keep. It would shift the way we spend money. It would cause us to speak up against injustice we have long ignored because we prefer to languish in comfortable certainty. It would challenge us to get involved, to live in such a way that we care for each other and care for our earth. It would instruct us to live in community in ways that are life-giving instead of power grabbing. It would ask us to reconsider what we do with every single day of our lives. It would change the very fundamental things about how you and I show up in the world. In short, if we really believed in resurrection, it would threaten everything. This is not a question of whether a man came back to life 2,000 years ago. This is the suggestion that if resurrection ever became something that was real to us, some fundamental things would need to change, and that is threatening. In the light of this resurrection threat, you and I are given a choice this Easter. We could stop in our tracks and go a completely different direction, a fear-filled and uncertain direction, for sure. A direction maybe we never thought we would go, even in our wildest imagination. A direction that doesn't make sense to a lot of people, that is, in fact, a bit threatening to the systems of this world in which we live. A direction that leads to life. Or, once threatened with resurrection, you and I, we can continue to live locked away, immobile in rooms filled with fear, driven eventually to lives of self-righteous anger, limited perspective, death. The choice is ours to make because resurrection is here and Jesus has shown up and stopped us in our tracks. We have been threatened with resurrection. In our own lifetimes, emerging from the horror and genocide of war, the brutal pillaging of a country and an indigenous people at the hands of national and international powers of terror, our voices, like the voice of Guatemalan teacher, principal pastoral counselor, poet, human rights activist, Julia Esquivel de Velasquez. While her native Guatemala experienced a legacy of greed and destruction, Esquivel de Velasquez watched as thousands and thousands of indigenous people groups were savagely murdered, villages literally wiped off the face of the planet in a massive and arbitrary expression of brutality. Speaking into some of the most appalling conditions of human rights in this world, a place where many, many children never live to see their first birthdays, where people are brutally murdered with impunity, where the pillaging for profit of indigenous lands, the forced labor of indigenous peoples, and violent racism decimating native peoples were the order of the day, Esquivel de Velasquez stood as a witness to God's love and compassion, speaking words of justice and truth and calling for change. And guess what? Her work was a threat. She was habitually harassed by authorities, narrowly escaping kidnapping, arrest, assassination. But she wasn't surprised. Not surprised in the least. She expected all of that. In her work, the poet suggests that violent and powerful forces are threatened by resurrection. That it is the very suggestion of life and possibility, of the reign of love and justice in this world, just the suggestion of resurrection that threatens powers and systems that must be stopped in their tracks, that must be changed. The words of the poet. Because every evening, though weary of killings, an endless inventory since 1954, yet we go on loving life and do not accept their death. Because in this marathon of hope, there are always others to relieve us who carry the strength to reach the finish line which lies beyond death. Join us in this vigil and you will know what it is to dream. Then you will know how marvelous it is to live threatened with resurrection, to dream awake, to keep watch asleep, to live while dying, and to know ourselves already resurrected. Friends, Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed, and because of that, you and I our world has been stopped in our tracks and threatened with resurrection. The question for us today is, will we change? Amen.